Thanks very much for this opportunity to share some of our thoughts about Shanghai Tower. We titled this presentation the ROI of Human Experience, and specifically we want to talk about some of the opportunities of double facades. Mr. Gu, our client, did a really nice presentation this morning where he talked, the number one point of his topic was the ROI of human capital, which is a similar idea. And the reason we want to talk about the ROI of human experience and human capital is that this is something that can be measured, it's very challenging to measure, and it's often overlooked when we talk about the performance of buildings, when we talk about sustainability. We often look at them in economic terms, and we overlook the human experience and the human capital component of projects. And thanks everyone for bearing with the translation. This will be a little bit slow, but we'll try to make it as exciting and interesting as we can. So Shanghai Tower came first for us. It's 4 times bigger than the project on the left. But we thought it would be interesting to talk about double facades as an idea that transcends just Shanghai Tower, and it's an idea that we can apply to more than one project. So I'd like to talk about the ROI of human experience today and use these 2 projects as examples. Shanghai Tower on the right, and a project that we're doing for a bank in the US called PNC. So this project on the left is called PNC Tower. And I'd like to share both of these as examples of what we mean by the ROI of human experience. So the world is increasingly urbanizing. We see, I think this is really interesting. At this time right here in 2011, very recently, we see the lines cross where the number of people living in rural environments is now less than the number of people living in urban environments. I think this is a really interesting thing for us to think about as we're creating the built environment. This might be the first time in the history of the world where more people will live in cities than in rural environments. And if we project forward to the year 2050, 2/3 of people will live in cities, and the urban population will have increased by 2/3. So this is the context for why a project like Shanghai Tower is important, because we need to address that more and more people will live in cities, and we need to make that experience sustainable and humane. These 2 projects both share a similar premise, which is that there is nothing more sustainable than to build a tower within the density of existing urban infrastructure, where you can connect to existing transportation networks and water infrastructure. Both of these projects share that premise. So even when we say that Shanghai Tower wants to be the greenest, tallest building in the world, right, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? And the case of PNC Tower on the left, we say it's the greenest high-rise in the world. We have to ask ourselves, how do you measure that, right? It's very hard to make a tower a net zero tower, right, a net zero building. So the argument that we make is both of these projects share is by being a part of urban infrastructure, they're already much more efficient than building a high-rise out in the middle of nowhere. So one of the things that we thought about as we put this presentation together is that the CTBUH is the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. But very often we talk about tall buildings. In fact, the logo, it emphasizes one metric for these projects over all others, and that is their height. And we think that it's important that we think about urban habitat as much as tall buildings. And these projects think about urban habitat. So the question becomes, how do we infuse urban habitat into tall buildings? And our answer with these 2 projects is that we are able to use the double facade as a key design strategy that makes it possible to build urban habitat into tall buildings. So you see here side-by-side comparisons where both of these towers incorporate sky gardens as well as a number of other features within a double facade. And I'll talk about each tower. First I'll talk about PNC, and then I'll end on Shanghai Tower. And I'd like you to see the common themes that the projects share, which is the double facade creates urban habitat at a variety of scales. So the question of ROI, we called the talk ROI. And Mr. Gu talked about ROI, and he gave some specific metrics this morning about ROI. So the normal equation for ROI is quite simple. The question is, how do we add in human experience into this equation in a plausible way? So if we're doing a project for a developer, they would look at ROI of human experience as something that's very hard to measure and pay more money for a building up front in order to generate returns on that investment in a spec office development, right? So what we think about is the number one expense for most companies is human capital. So changing productivity of human capital by a very small margin has an enormous leveraged return on the performance of a real estate asset and the company, therefore. And there's a body of work that talks about the increase on typing output or the reduction in errors when you simply measure in a clerical setting. Somebody who's just doing typing and data entry, you reduce the number of variables, and it's easier to measure the improvements that you get with sustainability and features that double facades offer. So there's this body of work out there, and the purpose of today's talk is not to go into this in a lot of detail, but to make you aware that it is out there, and this was part of the basis of our work on both of these projects. So what about the human experience? The ROI is just an economic equation. And I love this image. This is the Tesla Roadster. This car goes from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in 3.7 seconds. It's completely carbon neutral. So we think about the idea that this car is built on a completely redesigned chassis of what an automobile can be. And we asked ourselves, how do we redesign the chassis of the high-rise, similar to the way that this car has been completely re-engineered from the ground up to create a great human experience. As great as this car is, I'd actually like to draw your attention to the man inside the car and the experience he's having driving this vehicle through the desert. Right? What a great experience that is. And that's our goal when we design these projects, is to create an office environment that's as exhilarating as it is for him to drive this car. So now I will talk about PNC Tower and then Shanghai Tower and the common elements between them. In the case of PNC Tower, we started the project by asking ourselves these types of questions, and they led to this seminal question for the project, which is, what if a building could breathe? So the way that we make this building breathe is we create a solar chimney where hot air from the sun heats up air at the top, and that creates a return air draw through a chimney up in the middle of the tower. This draws fresh air in through the double facade and creates a naturally ventilated office area. So the entire building is wrapped in a double facade that compresses and expands into different sizes to create a variety of types of experiences at different scales. So you can see where we create focused office space as well as collaboration space that occurs in the layer of the double facade, similar to Shanghai Tower. And this gives you some images that show you those ideas of the different types of spaces that you encounter within the tower at different scales, all between the double facades. So this is the idea of the urban habitat brought into the high-rise building. And you don't have to go outside to get a breath of fresh air. You can do it within the building. We looked at a number of precedents for double-skinned facades as we were designing this project. And a lot of those precedents, the double-skinned facade is a technology that's applied to the outside of the building to make it more efficient. And the users are not aware of how that technology is working. So even though the building is more efficient because of the double facade, it hasn't necessarily benefited the human experience. So in the case of this double facade, it works in a number of different conditions over the course of the year. And in natural ventilation, air comes in across the floor plate, and you feel natural ventilation as a cooling for the tower. This shows you that even when the user doesn't open the facade, it still works on its own. The entire inner facade here is made out of wood, and the outer facade is made out of laminated low iron glass. So it's a very similar makeup to Shanghai Tower. Shanghai Tower also has the laminated low iron glass and then insulated glass inside. So PNC Tower is working on a similar concept. Using the wood curtain wall allows us to save 122,000 metric tons of CO2 every year just in the embodied carbon content of the curtain wall compared to a conventional aluminum facade. 91% of the floor plate is naturally daylit, and 42% of the year the building is in a completely passive mode with natural ventilation. So this is the return on investment from the environmental perspective and also from the human experience. This is a recent construction photograph, so you can see the progress of the tower. Interesting that Shanghai Tower and PNC Tower both finish at about the same time. But because Shanghai Tower is so much bigger, it had a head start of several years. So now I would like to talk about Shanghai Tower as China's tallest and greenest high-rise. So similar to PNC, the question was, how do we redesign the chassis of the super tall building to create a great human experience? As you heard Mr. Gu in the morning session, Shanghai Tower is similar to the dimension of the bund, tilted up vertically. The other important concept for Shanghai Tower was to create an icon of modern China, of a nation that's filled with a future of limitless possibility, as our client has said. So the vertical city is, as all of you are probably quite familiar now, and the project is right across the street. There's a tour this Friday. The vertical city is built into these 9 zones. At the bottom of every zone are 3 sky gardens. The very top zone is the observation level. So as Mr. Gu said this morning, we end up with 21 sky gardens arranged vertically throughout the tower. That's the urban habitat within the tower. So one of the key ideas here, as I said, is the double facade. We call it the intelligent skin for Shanghai Tower. So the outer facade is a triangle, and the inner facade is a circle in plan. So what this achieves is a very efficient construction where the inner facade is stacked vertically and those floor plates repeat each other, they repeat themselves, and it makes the construction very efficient. And then the form, the twisting shape, is accomplished entirely with the outer wall. So that's what creates this iconic form without making every floor plate different. And then the space that's left between those is the urban habitat of these sky gardens. So why do we call it the intelligent skin? What makes it intelligent? The skin itself is passive, it's not active. So its intelligence is derived from the way that it holds heat in the wintertime and creates an insulating blanket around the building in the wintertime. And in the summer operation, it sheds that heat back out. So we avoid that heat from loading the interior office space. So this reduced the metric tons of carbon that the building consumes. It saves energy use. So it has a clear economic ROI, a clear sustainability ROI, and it creates an iconic form and a great user experience. So this gives you a little bit more detail of the plan. You can see the core in the center here, surrounded by the super column structure, the inner facade, and then the triangular outer facade. And the outer facade is what is rotating. The inner facade is straight up and down, and that makes it very efficient and economical to build the inner facade and core structure. Just the outer facade creates this form. So Shanghai Tower facade, the outer facade, has approximately 30,000 curtain wall panels. Each one, the most that any one of them repeats is 3 times. So you can say in round numbers there are approximately 10,000 unique curtain wall panels. So this is very complex, but we make this very simple with this type of detail where you see the steel outrigger here that's shown here in the photograph, the gird going back, and then the sag rods. So that structure is supporting the curtain wall. And effectively, the horizontal dimension of this shelf is what changes as you go around the building and up floor by floor. So if you go across the street after the conference, you can look up and see this aluminum dimension here is what really records every floor of the tower. So we resolve the complexity of this facade and this detail in a very simple way, and it creates this kind of very unique experience. As Anthony mentioned this morning, there are very few super tall buildings that create a spatial experience within them. So Shanghai Tower is unique in this way, and the double facade of this tower is what creates that experience. These are some construction progress photographs. There are also quite a few on the wall around us. There's a video playing outside, and the tower is across the street. There's a tour on Friday, so there's plenty of opportunities for everyone to see this. One of the other interesting things about this twisting shape is it's not just an iconic form, but it also helps to reduce the wind load. So this is another way to measure the ROI of the tower. Here is a construction progress photograph of the sag rod being installed. If I go back, you can see this yellow platform is what is lowered. So it starts out at the top here off of these outriggers, and it's lowered floor by floor as they install the outrigger girths. And as it comes down, it lands at the very bottom. So what you see the gentleman installing in the next photograph is one of these sag rods, the coupling connection. This is a photograph of one of those unique curtain wall panels being installed. So after the steel primary structure is done, then the curtain wall is installed. And here you see in this construction progress photograph that space, that layer of space that's created in the double facade. Even from the outside, this is recognizable. And on a clear day, even from as far away as Puxi, you can see through this layer of space, especially in the morning and in the evening when the sun is behind or at a lower angle. So the double facade is something that's experienced not just from within the tower, but also from outside the tower. And right now the glass is very dirty. They've cleaned the first lowest zone across the street. So when you see the lower zone right now, you can get a better sense of how transparent the glass really is. The upper levels have a little bit of dirt from construction on them, so it's harder to see through. Just keep that in mind when you go out and look at it. So the double facade makes it possible to have a very transparent building. Much more than we could do with energy codes if we did not have a double facade. This is a recent photograph of the Sky Garden space from, this is taken on the 8th floor, so it's the lowest zone, zone 2. And you can see with the plants and it's starting to take shape the exciting space that's created between these two facades. And I want to emphasize again, this is the urban habitat within the tall building. And even though we talk about the urban habitat, it's still very exciting that it is tall. And this is a photograph from the observation level, near the observation level, that will be publicly accessible. So this is a very clear day, and you can see very far. This is where the wind turbines will be installed at the top of the tower. A photograph, older photograph during construction taken from the old city across the river. And a recent photograph looking up at the tower, where you can see the twist. And this is the final photograph. And one thing I want to acknowledge our clients. Without clients, we don't have the opportunity to do these kinds of projects, so thank you very much to our client. I'd also like to acknowledge all of the team that has worked on these projects. I think it's a myth in architecture that a single individual can design a building, and both of these projects have been touched by hundreds of architects, and if we include the engineers and the consultant teams, it's probably thousands of people, and then the people who actually build it. I'm always humbled as an architect to think about the person who actually builds these towers and puts these projects together, and then it gets into tens of thousands of people. So this is a group effort, team effort. I hope that this presentation has shown that there is return on investment beyond just the economics or sustainability, where we can factor in the human experience, and specifically the human experience of the urban habitat in tall buildings.